Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Migration Podcast. I'm your host. My name is Bernhard Schragl, Head of Corporate Communications here at ICMPD, the International Center for Migration Policy Development. Every year, ICMPD takes on the ambitious task of looking into the future. And so we have just released our ICMPD Migration Outlook 2026, our flagship report that serves as a gender-setting roadmap for the policy crowd, for researchers, and of course for anyone interested in these issues. And there's a second ambitious goal. The Migration Outlook dares to break down the super complex situation of migration into only 10 migration issues to look out for in 2026. To help us make sense of these migration issues, we are joined today by the main author of the Outlook, principal advisor at ICMPD and one of our most senior policy analysts, dear Martin Hofmann. Welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here.
Hello, Bernhard, and thanks for having me.
Okay, so Martin, as you know, we have published our ICMPD Migration Outlook in January, and we were quite delighted about the strong media response it has received. From Politico's Brussels Playbook to the Italian newswire ANSA, from EU Observer to the leading business daily in France, Les Echos. So I want to start with the topics that attracted most the attention of these media. Journalists like, for instance, Michele Esposito and Valentina Brini from ANSA, along with Vincent Collen at Les Echos, have presented an ambivalent signal. Irregular arrivals were down significantly in 2025, yet our report says we must stay more alert than ever. So why is this breathing space so elusive, and what, Martin, are the specific risks that could reverse this trend overnight?
Well, Bernhard, this is a very good question that is both easy and complicated to answer. So let me give it a try. I'm afraid it will take a little longer now, but I think it's necessary to understand why there's certainties and uncertainties at the same time. First, we have to deal with the principal challenge of any forecast and projection. We cannot foretell the future. We cannot know for sure what is going to happen. All we can do is think in scenarios, in likelihoods, in probabilities, and learning from the past, make informed assessments of what might happen in the future. So that's the first principle general we're always facing. Any annual situation that we look at is embedded in longer-term trends, in a longer-term environment, or as we call it, the general migration climate. And here, when it comes to the long-term developments, we know pretty well what drives migration and also in which direction. It's demography, it's economic imbalances, it's socioeconomic development, it's human development, it's shared communication spaces, it's transportation modalities, it's social networks, it's demand, it's supply, it's everything. And here we have factors that we can see over the longer term how they affect increase, decrease, or general migration. But then we have another set of drivers, and those are the ones that are the most impactful ones when we look at the debate also in Europe. And it's much more difficult to predict how they will evolve. And those drivers are war, civil war, and violent conflict. All the major migration-related events that have driven the debate in the past decades, we can say, were almost always related to this set of drivers, from the wars in the former Yugoslavia, the so-called refugee crisis in Syria in 2015, the situation in Afghanistan, and latest, the war in Ukraine, where the triggers of the significant or even massive flows of irregular arrivals and asylum seekers in Europe. And when we look at the actual situation in a given year, we could define this as an annual snapshot of the effects of longer-term trends plus the occurrence of so-called black swan events. Black swan events are events that nobody really foresees, that come unexpected but are very impactful. So a classic example again would be the war in Ukraine. So we have, when we think about 2026, we have the known unknowns. And unfortunately, there's always also unknown unknowns. And here an example would be COVID-19, where absolutely nobody expected this to happen. And then it did and had great impact on migration and mobility. And again, when we look at the past decades, the black swans have become a bit of a constant in the migration situation, migration developments. There were many of those black swans, and in a way we have to factor that in when we think about 2026 also. So concretely speaking, and we have, I think, described that in detail in the report, we have the longer term development, last year's trends, where the numbers of irregular arrivals went down, where the number of asylum applications went down, where the number of globally displaced went down. So we see a trend that is stable. We can expect that if nothing big happens, this will continue also next year. So we will see similar quantitative trends, most likely, maybe even decreasing. But then again, a single major event can change this picture completely, and this we have to factor in, that the level of global violence has not decreased last year. The contrary, it has increased. There are more conflicts, more people affected by violent events. It has not translated in larger migration or mobility yet, but that's the situation. So we are currently observing two opposing trends, and the question is, how will they relate to each other in 2026? And depending on that, we will see an ultimate outcome. Sorry for taking so long and being complicated, but that is how we have to assess the situation.
Well, it sounds quite fancy. Black swans, which become a constant. Yeah. You know, a complex situation deserves a long answer, of course. So now let me turn to some other journalists who featured the migration outlook. Gerardo Fortuna in the Brussels Playbook, he highlighted the hard slog of implementing the EU Pact for Asylum and Migration. So we have moved past the political signatures, but how will we actually measure the success of this pact in 2026?
It's a good question. First of all, I think it is necessary to say and safe to say that the pact represents the perhaps biggest reform package on EU migration legislation ever, or at least over the last decades. So it's an almost colossal task. Many observers, including myself, were not sure whether in face of the challenges and also the different viewpoints between the member states, they would actually manage to politically agree on the pact. They did, which was not a given. And that in itself was an important achievement and a vital signal that the EU still manages to find agreement and to act jointly in a contested and very difficult policy field. And then comes implementation. Again, an enormous task. Again, many observers, including myself, were not sure whether member states would really have the capacity to develop the necessary institutional arrangements, procedural arrangements, technical capacities for the actual implementation. We speak about more than 30 legislative texts. We speak about fundamental innovations like the screening procedures at the border, like the requirements towards interoperability of IT systems, and so on and so forth. And we speak about a very short time span of 2 years. That is really short for such an ambitious undertaking. But the first annual Asylum and Migration report published at the end of last year showed that member states made very good progress and the systems are well advanced. Challenges remain, but all in all, the progress is very good. So member states, the EU, can be quite satisfied and have good reasons for that. However, the public debate The media will not give too much credit for remarkable achievements on institutional reforms. That is something for us as experts who support also governments and administrations in making such reforms happen. The public and the media will ask, now you have implemented this pact, what is the actual result? What is the impact on the migration situation? Is the pact worthy in this respect? And I think that 2026 is the year when these questions will be raised and when the pact in the public debate will for the first time be measured against actual effects on a number of indicators. This might be a bit unfair in face of the enormous task and in face of the fact that reforms need time to show their effect, but the political debate is not always fair as we know it.
Okay, so in your report, when it comes to the topic of return, you are quite clear. Is it just about the return rate, which was 27% last year? Or is there a more profound metric? Is there a more comprehensive assessment that we should be watching?
The pact is, again, a very broad reform package, and it ranges from integration aspects to questions of external relations, migration diplomacy, cooperation with non-EU partners. However, politically speaking, there was an essential promise and essential commitment that numbers would go down when it comes to irregular arrivals, that numbers would go down when it comes to asylum applications, and most of all, that returns would go up. Returns, and we have to underline this, of people who have no right to stay on the territory of the EU, and where this has been confirmed in rather complex legal procedures. The return rate is a difficult indicator. It mixes together several other numbers, so perhaps it might not be the best indicator to really measure whether return works or not. But again, it's the indicator that is publicly debated. There is clear commitment to improve that rate. It has improved already quite significantly last year, so the expectations can be that this will continue. And again, it was the central political promise, and I think it will be the central indicator that is debated and where the political success of the pact will be measured against.
Mm-hmm. So there's one more journalist I want to quote. Nikolai Nielsen at EU Observer took a different angle at our report. He was focusing on our section on labor migration. You have noted that this year will see a rise in skills-based approaches. So how is labor migration being used not just for economics, but also as a core tool for EU geopolitics?
It is two questions interlinked, but I think with a bit of a different focus when looking at the same aspect of our outlook. As you know, every year we also try to look at those topics that are perhaps not really in the center of the public debate, which focuses a lot on aspects of irregular migration, asylum. We always also want to identify the trends in other areas, and particularly in labor migration. So now we have a long-term driver, coming back to my initial answer, for migration in the European context, the EU context, and that is demography. We have a constant trend towards aging populations with consequences on the labor market, and with a growing demand in a particular field, which is labeled as the so-called medium skills. Those are the tradespeople, the plumbers, the electricians, the skilled nurses, the skilled workers, where we have the biggest demand on our labor markets, but where we really have a problem with the supply. Our labor markets are highly formalized in those sectors, so without the necessary certificates, you simply cannot take up a job. It's as simple as that. And many educational systems outside of Europe do not provide for the same standards. So we have a mismatch, that is the so-called skills mismatch. It's not so much a mismatch of practical skills, but of formal qualifications. And since many years, those who look into the matter say, well, the only chance is that we really take our standards, bring them to countries of origin, where there's a young and interested population in acquiring those skills. And once they have it, then they have the same formal qualifications as people who would have completed an apprenticeship here, and then they can start working here. And now I really think for the first time we see very robust and well-developed initiatives trying to ensure that it's happening. It's at a small scale yet, but as we know, in these times you can scale up pretty quickly once you have learned how to do it. So I think that is a silent, quiet, but big breakthrough to improve the policies in a very important field. That was the skills mismatch. The geopolitical issue is also interesting. Again, a walk down memory lane tells us that in reality, what we call migration diplomacy, so high politics engaged in migration outside of the EU, really started 2015 and in a reaction to the refugee crisis. Before that, we didn't have too much of that. So then there was the attempt to use the geopolitical position of the EU in order to achieve migration objectives, economic power, diplomatic power, so on and so forth. Meanwhile, and here the Global Gateway Initiative that I quote in the Outlook, we see a bit of a change in that trend, that the EU tries or begins to try to include mobility and migration aspects in a toolbox to better the geopolitical positioning of the EU. In these initiatives, we speak about a huge investment, infrastructure development initiative that should outbalance the approaches by other actors like China or the US. Mobility, migration is one of the pillars that will be negotiated, that will be part of it. And I think that is a bit of a remarkable change of the role of labor migration and mobility in EU foreign policy.
Now let's take a look back at last year's migration outlook, because it proves how the predictions become reality. So last year, the migration outlook predicted an increase in migration flows from Venezuela and South America due to President Trump taking office. And that's exactly what has happened. By summer of 2025, Venezuela was already the number one country of origin in terms of asylum applications in the EU. So now, following the US military intervention beginning of this year in Venezuela, the region is at a crossroads, without any doubt. And in our report, we outlined two very different scenarios. Martin, can you please describe these scenarios and why you consider them as the most likely ones?
Well, taking a step back and answering your question, last year it was already foreseeable that the second Trump administration would implement a highly restrictive policy on irregular migration and on refugees, and that this might have some consequences for Europe as well. In terms of the arrival of asylum and protection seekers from Latin American countries. And then the Trump administration, as we all know, did implement these policies. There are major effects on arrivals at the US borders, which have gone down significantly. There are the raids, there are large-scale expulsions, etc. And there are shifts in flows in the Americas toward the south, for instance, Brazil. In Europe, the picture is not that conclusive. There were no increases, but rather decreases in arrivals from important Latin American countries like Colombia or Peru. But there was a clear increase in arrivals from Venezuela. Most Venezuelans go to Spain, almost all of them. Now, the US military strike from January opened two likely scenarios. In the first scenario, a pattern similar to the post-Assad Syria situation could emerge, with parts of the Venezuelan diaspora returning home and a reduction in new asylum applications. In the second scenario, renewed instability could further worsen living conditions, prompting additional displacement and spillover effects across Latin America. And then also Europe would face a further increase in arrivals from Venezuela. Those will always be limited in numbers compared to other situations, because plane is the only means of travel to reach Europe. So those are the two scenarios, and it's too early to tell which of the one will ultimately unfold in 2026.
So now we talked a lot about Venezuela, but what about other black boxes? And by black boxes, I mean countries where further developments are hard to predict, but could be very, very impactful. So Martin, how do we forecast 2026 for Sudan, for Iran, for Afghanistan, and of course for Ukraine, where the range of outcomes could result in millions of people moving in either direction?
Well, you basically answered your question already by using the term black box, which implies that we cannot really tell what will happen. What is clear that the closer the situation is to Europe in geographical terms, the more impactful a worsening of the conflict situation would be in terms of the numbers trying to reach Europe. In case of Ukraine, as you have mentioned, we speak about millions in the worst case of a military loss and a large-scale occupation of Ukrainian territory. In other situations, it will be the immediate neighborhood affected first and foremost, at least in the year to come. Subsequent onward flows to Europe would be likely, but the numbers would be smaller compared to the ones from a worsening in Ukraine. But again, we speak about scenarios. We should not doom-monger. We should not try to predict what actually will or would happen. But we should discuss what might happen and whether we could be prepared for it, politically and operationally. And sometimes I have my doubts that these situations receive the attention in a political debate that they deserve, because, as you have said, something big could happen anytime.
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to specific regions, the report highlights something which was for me quite big news, because I didn't read a lot about it in other media. So the report highlights a deepening and shifting relationship with North Africa. We are seeing states like Tunisia and Egypt move from being transit hubs to countries of destination. So Martin, how does this change the nature of the agreements that the European Union is negotiating in the Mediterranean?
On the one side, shared challenges mainly in political terms, make it politically easier to reach agreements, and the prevention of irregular flows is this overriding goal that meanwhile both sides of the Mediterranean share. Irregular migration is not the only issue. There are other issues, and there are areas still quite contested between the two sides of the Med, but when it comes to the prevention, reduction of irregular migration, they agree largely and cooperate much more than they used to. And this joint goal has turned into, would say, the main catalyst for the agreements of the recent past that you have mentioned. My expectation is that in 2026, North African countries will keep evolving in their role as moving from just being transit spots to becoming both destinations and major hubs for different kinds of migration flows. And that also means that they will likely feel more impact from the conflict situations that you have mentioned in sub-Saharan Africa, which might also motivate even closer cooperation with the EU. But I think that cooperation with the EU will go beyond just control measures or expulsions or returns, and will also focus on the aspects we have mentioned before: joint skills development, economic cooperation, smoother labor mobility. One can argue that around the Mediterranean, states on both sides are turning into more of an interconnected region, facing similar challenges and opportunities as well, hopefully, when it comes to migration. Thus, and this is also an important observation for the near and more distant future, restricting flows alone will not prevent them from happening. In order to make a real change, both sides, the EU and the southern Mediterranean partners, we need to tackle the so-called root causes of displacement much better. And that is conflict, as we know. And that is, I think, where both sides have to engage more to really see lasting effects also when it comes to displacement and irregular migration.
Mm-hmm. So now let's turn to the maybe most abstract migration issue to look out for. The report describes a so-called sustained realpolitik turn. This sounds quite pragmatic, but perhaps even a little cold. So does this mean that migration policy is now driven entirely by national interests and security? And how is this related to humanitarian aid that was cut globally?
Well, again, this issue refers more to a general observation that we have made last year, and that is expected to continue in 2026. Last year, for the first time in many years, European governments resumed returns of irregular migrants to Syria and Afghanistan on the basis of agreements with the authorities in those countries. We speak about relatively small numbers and specific groups, was primarily convicted offenders. But they still reflected this, as you have mentioned, broader realpolitik turn in which migration policy objectives take precedence over concerns related to democratic rule or good governance. This shift has drawn some criticism from civil society and segments of the public. There's no doubt about that. But I think that despite the shift you have mentioned, return policies remain embedded in quite robust legal guardrails. So the framework expands for returns, but it does not change the rules that exist in Europe fundamentally. So against this background and following a further realpolitik turn, a further expansion and intensification of return operations can be expected, but it's not foreseeable, it's not expected that there might be a shift towards large-scale deportation policies as we see them in the US at the moment. And yes, realpolitik turn has also meant severe cuts in ODA, in development assistance, also in humanitarian assistance. It was not just the US, it was also European governments who have reduced significantly those contributions, and particularly in the area of humanitarian support in rather acute refugee situations. This is a certain risk that when food rations have to be cut in half, when other basic supplies are not there anymore, we know from the past that this might lead to movements out of those situations. And again, here would be my advice to watch those, particularly in the European neighborhood, those situations very carefully and consider, shouldn't governments step up and fill the gaps that have evolved in the area of humanitarian assistance?
Okay. So now before we wrap up, since we have covered the most important migration issues now, so before we wrap up, I want to take a look behind the scenes. I would like to pull back the curtain on the process, on the making of the report. So as the main author, you have to integrate an incredible amount of data, of information, of inputs and of opinions. So, Martin, so how do you steer these contributions from all across the organization? Who else does contribute?
Well, it is safe to say that ICMPD Migration Outlook is really a whole of organization exercise that involves contributions from all parts of the institution, from all regions that we work in, and from all levels, from the junior colleagues up to executive management and the Director General. I am merely the hand that holds the pen in the end, or presses the button on the keyboard, the one that brings all inputs and views together. Together with my colleagues from the research and policy units, we of course observe migration trends and migration policy developments throughout the year. And over time, those trends of particular interest emerge, defining a first framework for deeper analysis. The colleagues in the field provide us with information and assessments from the regions. I think that is one of the major strong points of our approach. Also to outbalance a bit the purely Eurocentric approach. Let me stress here that the colleagues currently completing a number of regional migration outlooks that will be available in the course of the next weeks and are a great source to deepen an understanding of regional contexts and priorities. And then, as you know, we have a discussion with the Director General and the Director of Policy and Research in December to decide those are the topics we want to go for this time. It is the concept of our outlook that we say yes, the list of topics is relevant, but it does not claim to be fully exhaustive. Those are our ideas on what might be relevant and what might happen. What are your thoughts? Let us engage, let us discuss. We do not claim to be right and complete. All we want to claim is that we have a number of relevant thoughts and some good arguments to support them. Yeah, and then we have an intense period of writing it all up. And then the unexpected event comes that needs to be included. This year it was Venezuela. And if we are lucky, we meet the tight time plan and schedule. And here we are, recording the podcast as one of the final steps in the annual cycle.
Okay, but I have a very final question now. And for me, that's the question about the biggest secret of this migration outlook. At least for me, that's the kind of magic of this outlook. So, Martin, how does an observation become a forecast? And how does a forecast become one of the 10 migration issues to look out for? So how do you choose? How do you pick from an almost unmanageable amount of developments, observations, and forecasts?
Well, a first principle is that we always want to be balanced. So not only talk about the issues mostly debated in the media or public sphere, we always want to look at the quieter areas of labor migration or partnerships or external relations as well, for instance. That frames the decisions on the issues to a certain degree. We do not want to have too many of them at the same time, and we don't want to be too detailed or granular. Some are always self-evident, as I would call it. This year it is the Migration Pact, which, as you know, is not easy to present due to its complexity and many aspects, but we gave it a try. And finally, we want our issues to be stimulating in a sense that our audiences say, your points seem to be quite relevant, but why didn't you talk about this topic or that topic? And then we would say, great, let us talk about that point now, because this is exactly what we want to achieve. We want to stimulate discussion. So those are the considerations, and then we don't want to end up with 20 and we don't want to end up with 3. So the selection is made on the basis of these considerations I have tried to outline here.
So that means that until Venezuela happened, there were only 9 migration issues to look out for?
Very precisely 9 until Venezuela happened.
Okay.
There is, of course, another aspect that is absolutely essential, and that refers to you, Bernhard. It is about the communication aspects on the one side, but also about the great efforts and work that you and your team put in the Outlook every year. So maybe at the end of our talk, you share a few thoughts on that with me and the podcast audience. What is your role and what are your colleagues doing for the Outlook?
Okay, thank you, Martin. Well, I'm not prepared for this question. In fact, I'm the one to put questions here. But okay, since you are asking, thank you very much for the question. Of course, it's first and foremost a team effort. It's about a publication. It's a print publication. There's a video. There's a social media campaign. And of course, there's a lot of press work. And most important here, our new Director General, Susanne Raab, took the effort to discuss this migration outlook with several journalists in Brussels. But all in all, it depends on the content and on the 2 ambitious goals, and that this is daring to look into the future, and this is daring to break it down to 10 or 9 migration issues to look out for. Martin, thank you for sharing these insights and for the incredible work that went into this year's Outlook. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and hopefully see you next year.
That was Martin Hofmann, Principal Advisor to the Director General here at ICMPD and main author of the ICMPD Migration Outlook 2026. If you want to know more, please download the full Migration Outlook on our website. I am Bernhard Schragl, and this has been another episode of the Migration Podcast. Follow us and listen to more episodes on our website and on all other social media channels. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time.